Thanks everyone for joining to talk a little bit more about how nonprofits can navigate, election season, which is coming up so soon. So we thank you so much for joining this webinar this morning to learn a bit more about how to do that. And we're so grateful to have Susan Finkel-Sorless here, who serves as Senior Counsel for Affiliate Organizations with Boulder Advocacy. And in her role, she provides legal guidance on advocacy and political programs to nonprofit organizations and has more than a decade of experience with nonprofit advocacy and campaign finance regulations, both at the federal and state levels. So thank you so much, Susan, for joining us this morning, and really looking forward to learning more from you. And with that, thanks so much, and thanks for joining, everyone.
So good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you on what is a beautiful day outside today. And we're here to talk about how to remain nonpartisan, or what it means to be nonpartisan in these ever so partisan times. My name is Susan Finkel-Sorless, and I am with Boulder Advocacy and Alliance for Justice. So Alliance for Justice is a nonprofit organization with over 150 member organizations across the country. We are committed to creating a just and equitable society through our justice programs and our Boulder Advocacy programs. At Boulder Advocacy, we provide guidelines, trainings, and other materials for nonprofits to use. And so I must, although we provide trainings and guidelines, we cannot provide any legal advice. And this presentation is for informational purposes only. We cannot, although we are attorneys, we cannot be your attorney. So our agenda today, we're going to go over what nonprofits are, who is a nonprofit, specifically 501c3 public charities, and what you can do in an election year. And we're going to take a look on what it means to be nonpartisan. We're going to talk about advocacy in an election year, with your lobbying, your advocacy efforts, how you can conduct that in an election year. We're also going to talk about nonpartisan activities and activities, voter outreach and voter education that you can do. And then we're also going to finalize with your personal rights. What are your own individual rights or individual capabilities to participate in elections outside of your 501c3 organization? Now, throughout this presentation, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and I will get to them as soon as possible. But please put them in the chat as soon as you have a question. So first, we're going to start with the basics. And this may be a review for some of you, but we're going to look at the different types of nonprofits from the IRS perspective and their tax status. And so, of course, 501c3s, you are the trusted messengers in your community. You can educate and advocate to further your charitable mission, and that includes nonpartisan activities. So 501c3 public charities like Alliance for Justice, like Global Health Council, and organizations like yours, from the IRS perspective, you have a very favorable tax treatment. One, we are tax exempt, meaning we do not pay taxes on the contributions that we receive. We also can provide a tax deduction to our donors, meaning they can take a tax deduction. Now, in exchange for that very favorable tax status, lobbying activities are limited. Lobbying is not something we're only going to touch on it quickly this morning, but your lobbying activities, you have a cap of how much lobbying that you can do. Now, your electoral activities, you cannot support or oppose candidates for public office. You cannot engage in any partisan activities. And we're going to dive down into that pretty quickly, so to get a baseline understanding of what is partisan and who is a candidate. We can compare that to Alliance for Justice Action. Those are 501c4 social welfare organizations, and they are also out there advocating for the community, advocating for a social welfare. They'll also participate in elections. But 501c4 social welfare organizations, their treatment is very similar to 501c5 union and 501c4s, 501c6s, which are professional organizations such as Chamber of Congress, excuse me, such as Chamber of Commerce's. So their tax treatment is that they themselves are tax exempt, but they do not provide a tax deduction to their donors. So in exchange for that that type of tax status, their lobbying activities are unlimited. They can engage in as much lobbying as they want, as well as they can do some partisan political activity as long as it's a secondary activity. It's not their main activity. It's not their major purpose. And then they'll have to make sure that they're following federal and state election law on any partisan reporting if they're conducting partisan activity. So what does it mean to be nonpartisan? Because 501c3s must remain nonpartisan. So what it means basically is that you cannot support or oppose candidates for public office. And that's whether endorsing a candidate, whether it's saying vote for or vote against a candidate, or conducting activity that would show your support or have the effect of your support or opposition to a particular candidate, whether or not you actually say vote for or vote against, depending on your messaging, you don't want to show any support or opposition. And so this includes candidates that are running as an independent. They're not affiliated with a political party. They're candidates as well. Also, it includes those running for nonpartisan offices. So, for example, sometimes state board of elections, local offices, judges, state Supreme Court judges, they're what's called, sometimes they run on the ticket in a nonpartisan office, meaning that their designation of whether or not of what type of party they belong to is not shown on the ballot, but for IRS purposes, they are still a candidate, and any support or opposition would be partisan support by the C3. So nonpartisan means you cannot support or oppose a candidate for office, including those running for those nonpartisan positions. So let's talk about who is a candidate. And the IRS defines a candidate as any individual who's offering themselves or proposed by others who is running for an elected public office. You know, these could be the officially declared candidates, as well as those who are widely, there's a hype surrounding them, around them. Like a few years back, there was, a lot of talk about Oprah Winfrey running for president, Kanye West running for president. Even if they're not declared, they haven't declared yet, their support on their potential candidacy would be considered political activity by the 501c3. So let's also talk about what is public office. This is an office that's created by statute. It's an ongoing position. There's a fixed term. They must run for re-election. It requires an oath of office. This also includes things like school boards. It does not include the appointment of public officials, and it includes those nonpartisan offices. So what are examples of what is considered support or opposition? Well, again, it's those direct or in-kind contributions, whether or not you give a monetary contribution or you give service of value, staff time, research, anything of value that you're giving is considered what is considered an in-kind contribution. That is the same, any Contributions include direct or in kind. There's no difference. If you endorse a candidate, if you say vote for or vote against, when you compare candidates to each other in such a way that would lead the reader to understand which one you supported versus the other. When you're commenting on a candidate's fitness for office or fitness to hold office, when we want to talk about accountability activity, or if you want, it's part of your advocacy and your lobbying, you want to call out a elected official, that's fine as long as you're talking about them in such a way that you're talking about the policy and you're talking about the issue. But if you comment on their fitness for office or include any personal attributes, then that's what's considered support or opposition. When you want to give candidates preferential treatment, letting your org use a candidate's your name used by the candidate or a political party, that is also considered partisan activity. And this is not an exhaustive list, okay? There's a lot more. This is not everything. And it all depends on whether or not on the facts and circumstances test, on whether or not it is support or opposition. So we're going to dive deeper into how a 501c4, how a C3 public charity can stay within those guardrails of between supporting or opposing candidates, or political parties. How do you stay in that line, how to stay in those lanes of nonpartisan activity? So we're going to talk about what is considered partisan, and what we look at is something called the facts and circumstances test. And the facts and circumstances test, it's a spectrum of risk based on all those facts and circumstances. And so you're going to look at what is the purpose of the communication? Why are you speaking now? Who is the audience that you're trying to communicate with? What is influencing your timing to speak? What is the purpose of the activity? And the facts and circumstances test, we're going to check it's a balancing test. It's a balancing test between what is very low risk or what is high risk, or what a lot of times is in the middle. It's a yellow light. And sometimes you decide to go through the yellow light. Sometimes you decide not to go through a yellow light. It's an assumption of the risk. It's trying to look at what is your risk as an organization. So let's look at what those facts and circumstances are. This is how the IRS looks at these. The IRS is going to look at all the facts and circumstances surrounding the communication or your activity, not just the communication itself, not just the snippet of what you say on social media. And some of the facts and circumstances that will show that the communication is nonpartisan is that you are not referencing a candidate or the elections. That's pretty easy. The external factor is driving the timing. And so what we mean that is what external factor is the impetus for you to speak now? Is there a vote in Congress? Was there a Supreme Court decision? Is there a news item, something that happened that has nothing to do with the election? So there's an external factor other than the election that is asking you to talk now. You're also targeting a sector of the community that is unrelated to a candidate's election. You are talking to your organization's members. You are talking to your public. You are talking to the people that you serve, or you're talking to a community that you want to serve. Next, if the information is about your core values, your core issues that you work on, that is a good indication that it is a nonpartisan activity. Again, it's not just you can't just pick out one or two. You have to look at all the factors together and do this balancing test. And also, the organization has a history of similar advocacy on the issue, meaning That if you are, you're in the health community, you've always talked about, expanding Medicare or Medicaid, expanding that. And so if you are always talking about it, then that, you have a history of that. If you wanted to next add, talk about the environment, that's fine, but not an electoral activity. And, you may want to start talking about that sooner. Now, the things that would make you look like it's a partisan communication, and again, there's no one check mark, is when you are referring to a candidate. And elected officials are candidates as well. So, you may be referencing elected official in their elected official capacity, in their capacity as a senator, and you want them to vote for your bill. You're referring to them as an elected official versus referring to them as a candidate. Second, your timing is motivated by the election. This is important. Something that could be seen as perfectly nonpartisan in November 2023 would be seen as partisan in November of 2024 because of the timing. The bill that was voted on in January of earlier this year, and you thanked the elected officials that took that vote, thanking them in October. The timing is motivated by the election, no more motivated by the legislative vote. The third thing is, who are you communicating with? Why are you communicating to a specific community? Is it to influence a candidate's election? Do you want to talk to, well, I want to talk to the people that I think will a tendency to vote for this type of candidate or this party in this election. That targeting would be considered partisan by the IRS. Also, if you compare the candidates with the organization's preferred position. Later on in this presentation, we're going to talk about voter guides and voter education on candidates' positions. And that is something you can do in a nonpartisan way. But as long as you're not talking about the candidate's position with how your organization would prefer or judge the candidate's position against your own position. And lastly, and sometimes this gets a little tricky, is when you emphasize wedge issues during the election, when you're doing any partisan voter activity and you talk about wedge issues are those that divide candidates. And the one thing is the IRS has pointed to choice or abortion as a wedge issue. That is the example that they use, because there is definitely one party on one side that has a position and one party and candidates on another side that has a position. And so when you are doing electoral activity, nonpartisan electoral activity, you need to be careful of talking about the issues at the same time. It's not that you can't do your advocacy work that you've always done in the advocacy capacity, but we'll talk more about when you start doing voter outreach or voter activity, that you do want to be very careful about wedge issues. And although the IRS uses abortion or choice as its example as a wedge issue, there could be other wedge issues in local elections. Or in other state elections. There could be, it could be different, if that's the hot button issue that two candidates have taken an opposing view and they're actively campaigning on that issue, that is what we would consider a wedge issue. So I have a couple examples where we can apply the facts and circumstances test. So in California, 501c3 that is focused on LGBTQ rights, and they have a history of this issue. So in January 2024, during the U.S. Senate hearings on the U.S. Citizenship Act, It pays for an ad in the local newspaper urging for the passing of the Equality Act. And the organization has a track record of boldly advocating for I'm sorry, pardon me. Sorry, apologies. LGBTQ community. Okay. So the timing, it's January 2024. And something has happened, a vote has happened, the hearings are happening on the US Citizenship Act. And so this California-based put out this message. So with all the faux facts and circumstances test, we would look at this at the ad as low risk for this organization and for this timing based on everything. So now let's change up some of the facts and circumstances. So 501c3 focused on reproductive rights. In October 2024, it pays for the same ad in the newspaper, right? So in the Senate race, the incumbent champions the Equality Act and the challenger strongly opposes the act. So when we look at this, when we look at all these facts and circumstances, we would consider this high risk. Remember, the vote or the hearings that were taking place happened in January of 2024. That's when the outside the organization event happened, right? This timing, nothing is going on. There's no hearings. The closest event that's happening is the election. And the Equality Act is something that the two senates, the two candidates for US Senate have taken two opposing views, and they are campaigning on those opposing views. And finally, it's a organization that's focused on reproductive rights. And this is the first time that they've decided to talk about the Equality Act. And so we would consider this high risk because of all those facts and circumstances. So it is based on the timing, based on the wedge issue, based on that this organization has not discussed this issue before, all points to a high risk activity. So we're going to look at now the practical concerns of the facts and circumstances test and the practical concerns. So we first have to look and make sure that we are conducting our activity as nonpartisan, because we have to first follow the regulations that govern your tax status. As a public charity, you must remain nonpartisan. Second to consider is your funders. Funders are giving to your organization and your work to fund that nonpartisan work. They may not, they are not funding your partisan work. They may also be a 501c3 public charity, or they may be maybe a 501c3 private foundation, and they cannot fund partisan activity. And so they want you to be nonpartisan as well, because if they fund it, then that's you could unintentionally ding them as well. So finally, unfortunately, you will also want your reputation in the community. You want to be known as the trusted voice in the community. And finally, there are other people on the other side. Everyone has the opposing viewpoint. And they may, if they perceive that you are not following the regulations, or if you engaged in partisan activity, you may get some unwarranted attention or complaints in the press. And it could be a diversion of your resources having to defend yourself. And so you want to make sure that you're staying nonpartisan, basically for all of these reasons. So now that we've talked about what you can't do or shouldn't do, or how you shouldn't do it, what can you do in an election year? Because you can still engage in your advocacy, your lobbying, and candidate education. First one we're going to talk about is your lobbying. okay? You can still lobby. You can still do your direct lobbying and your grassroots advocacy, as long as you are focusing on the public policy issues, as long as you're not criticizing elected officials to influence the elections. You can continue to ongoing criticism of an incumbent's track record on how it relates to the issue. So if there is a vote in your state legislative body in September, and you need to advocate for or against that vote, you keep engaging in your lobbying and your advocacy, and engage with them as a elected official in their capacity as an elected official and where they stand on the policy. Do not criticize their personal characteristics or their fitness for office. Next, so let's talk about legislation to make sure that you're talking about legislation. And the regulations define legislation as an act by legislative body, including introduction, amendment, enactment, defeat, or appeals of resolutions. These includes appropriations. It includes actions by Congress, a state legislator, or a legislative body, such as a city council. School boards are not legislators, FYI. In addition, it could be the confirmation of an executive or judicial branch nominee, or proposed treaties that require Senate approvals. All of this is specific, this is legislation, and you can continue to talk about policy proposals and legislation during an election year. You could also be a voice for your community. You can criticize incumbents. You can respond to incumbents and what they are doing if they are voting for or against your bill. You want to make sure that you're not using personal attributes or characteristics if you're calling out an elected official. You want to focus on the policy and the issue. Don't use criticism to thank legislators to influence the election. Like, for example, again, if a bill was a vote was taken in January, don't decide to thank the legislators in October. And, when you're also thinking about thanking legislators, thank all the legislators that took that vote. Criticize all the legislators that voted no, not just deciding that I'm just going to talk to one or two of them. So ballot measures. Nonprofits can engage in supporting or opposing ballot measures. Ballot measures are direct lobbying. They are subject to your lobbying cap. It is direct lobbying, so it's part of the larger cap if you're a 501(h) elector. It's not prohibited campaign intervention or partisan activity to support or oppose candidates. You can, I'm sorry, pardon me. It is not considered partisan activity to support or oppose a ballot initiative to educate the public and tell the public to vote yes or vote no on a ballot measure. That is, that is lobbying. So nominees, you can support or oppose nominees like federal judgeships, or in some cases, state courts, or any nominees. If it requires a legislative vote, you can absolutely engage in this type of activity. It may count as lobbying under the IRS rules and some of the state rules. You could also continue with your regulatory advocacy and litigation. You can work with the executive branch and federal agencies or state agencies to discuss regulations or rulemaking. They are not legislators. Regulations and rulemaking are not isn't legislation. So you can try to get them to work on the enforcement of existing laws. For example, here we have example of the Federation of American Scientists, and they're trying to work, they want OSHA to create heat standards for the summer for workers that have to be outside, to get them breaks, to get them water breaks, to get them shade breaks. This activity is not lobbying, but it's good advocacy that they can do even during an election year. And they can also work on litigation and voting rights. And any litigation is not lobbying, it's not electoral activity. So fact checking, you can fact check candidates. You can comment on what a candidate says if they say something that is wrong, right? And sometimes this is an activity that an organization is going to do during a debate. You need to be very careful that you are not criticizing the candidate. Again, don't criticize, don't discuss personal attributes. Remember all the facts and circumstances. Do you have a track record on this? Are you correcting, making the correction that is not commenting on the fitness for office? It's about the policy. For example, let's say a candidate says in a debate that there's not a problem with the cost of living or the cost of apartment leases in the city, just no one wants to be there. You may be able to respond, with the fact that the average apartment has risen 350% in the past year, lack of access to public transportation is the reason those surveyed why they cannot afford to live in the city. Okay. So you're talking about the policy. You're not criticizing the candidate that said it. You're correcting the record, but you need to be very careful about that and how you present that. So are there any questions so far? If you have, please put them in the chat. So your tax status follows you everywhere, even on social media. You can follow an elected official in their official capacity, but not in their campaign capacity. So for example, on here, we have Mike Braun. We can follow his official Twitter account as an elected official, but we shouldn't be responding or liking or following candidate Mike Braun. You can also engage in candidate education. You can offer materials, information, reports on your community and the community that you serve to educate candidates. As long as you are not creating anything new, you are not creating a new resource. You are using information you've already gathered. This could be a report, on a program that you have already distributed. As long as you were distributing it to all candidates on both sides, opposing sides, you only want to create new information if your organization has another reason to do so. And you don't want to publicize something that is specific to any particular candidate. You always need to make sure that you offer it to all candidates in the election. So let's talk about nonpartisan civic engagement. Okay. So we have a question. I assume that all of what's allowed and not allowed for 501c3s applies to both internal and external. Do staff only Slack channel? It's probably a best practice. We're going to talk about whether or not you're operating later on. Deirdre, this is a great question. We're going to talk about later on about what you can do with an individual, and your individual right to engage in elections. But that means that you are not representing your organization, and you're not using any of your organization's resources. And so I'm not sure about the staff only Slack channel. When you mean by that, are you talking about, okay, this is not the staff Slack channel. This is not the organization Slack channel. This is us on our own. That may be one thing, but there are some best practices that we'll talk about later at the last one. Okay, and then you mentioned that you can follow elected official Brown, but not candidate Brown. What if elected? Well, the thing on Amy, that's a good question. So if because all incumbents, most elected officials are most likely up for reelection, right? Unless they've said, I'm not up for reelection, right? Or I'm stepping down, or I've reached my term limits. You're still going to only follow their social media in their official capacity, right? If they started a second, their official Twitter page for uh their status as an elected official, it shouldn't contain any campaign materials. We would hope, we would think. And so I think you could still follow them, their elected official um, thing. So, yeah. So we've talked about how you can relate to candidates, how you can talk to or advocate to lobbying for elected officials and everything. Now let's talk about the public, how you can educate the public, how you can work with the public and this nonpartisan voter outreach, and how you can work. So you are, again, you are the trusted messengers in your community. Um, we want to encourage nonprofits to use their voice to encourage that civic engagement. You can absolutely educate voters on the process of voting. When are the deadlines to register or turn in their ballot? And in not so far long ago in 2020 during COVID, that was all of a sudden we had people wanting to vote by mail. All of a sudden we needed to figure out a way, the elected officials, the Secretary of States, everyone needed to figure out a way how to vote safely and securely during that process. And so there was a lot of voter education out there on how people could vote, like get your mail ballot, bring in a pen, bring your own pen, bring your, wear your mask, make sure, stand 6 feet away. C3's really stepped up to educate people on how to vote safely. And that's a good thing. And that's, as a trusted messenger, you can do that. You can also do candidate questionnaires. You can also educate the voters on where candidates stand on the issues, okay? But you have to be very careful. You want to include, you want unbiased questions. You don't want your questions to hint at the correct answer. So use open-ended questions. Avoid yes or no or support or oppose questions, right? You want a format that allows the candidate to explain their answer. You can limit, as long as you are limiting, limit to 500 characters or something, as long as both candidates, opposing candidates, get the same treatment, okay? Candidate questionnaires that are nonpartisan, you're going to allow the reader to make up their own mind. You are giving them, there's no hint of who they should vote for or who the organization would like them to vote for. You want to distribute the questions to all the candidates. You don't want to compare the responses to organization views. Like you have the question on the environment, the candidate answers, and then you comment on like, and by the way, this is where our organization stands. You don't want to grade or comment on whether or not you thought that was a correct answer. You also don't want to ask the candidate to pledge their support. If elected, I will vote for this bill. Again, the reader needs to make up their own decision. So you want equal formatting, you want a broad range of issues, and you want to present responses equally. You also may want to have a disclaimer. Sometimes you'll see a disclaimer, and we'll talk about disclaimers, saying that this is not an endorsement. None of this is an endorsement. So One of the things is that also we get a lot of questions is like you send out these candidate questionnaires, and you don't get any answers. You know, or you only no answer is given to everything. You may want to consider whether or not you publish. We have some guidelines. It's a risk factor. Let's say that both candidates answered about 20 questions and they all answer, you know, one didn't answer two of them. That might be fine to put no answer down, right? But if one candidate, if it's candidate questionnaire and you only get answers from one candidate, you probably do not want to be, you're probably not going to be able to go ahead with that candidate questionnaire because you don't have the, you know, you're not able to present the responses. So you can also undertake some candidate forums and debates. You know, for candidates, you know, for debates, you have an equal opportunity. For the audience is not biased. You're allowing all viable candidates, and you don't have to invite all candidates. You need to invite the viable candidates, and you need a good faith-based effort on determining who is a viable candidate. You know, you also want questions to be far and broad ranged, and you want a moderate and neutral, you want an independent or neutral moderator. Again, you don't want to ask the candidates for their pledges. Last thing, and you know, last thing we have is that you can have appearances.
Tapti eventually went to see Kayo today.
Um, last thing, you can have appearances that are unrelated to the candidacy. So, you know, maybe, you know, if you had a dinner last month and you want to invite an elected official to that fundraiser because they're the big draw, you can sell a lot of tickets. You can
Good, she
invite
did
them.
not put photo of Kayo.
I'm sorry, I think somebody is off of mute. You may want to check. You can also invite somebody who's a candidate, but if they're a expertise in something that's beyond their candidacy, such as the early childhood education expert, you invite them because they're an expert in that capacity. So there's no equal opportunity required. You want to avoid mentioning any candidacy. You don't want to time the event with the election. And you also want disclaimers and letters to the candidate. You know, in the program, in the invitations, you know, Nancy Pelosi is here in her official capacity and not as a candidate, and this is not an endorsement of her. Also, you want to be aware that, especially at sometimes at these events, you know, people are human. Maybe somebody gets up and they say, yes, and that's why you need to be reelected, and that's why we support your candidacy. You want to quickly dispel that. You want to quickly get back up there and you want to say, you know, hello, this is as a 501c3, we are not endorsing any candidate. We cannot endorse any candidate, and this person is here in their own personal capacity. So whenever you have any disclaimer on voter education activities, such as, you know, at these events, at whenever you do out at a candidate education or voter education, you know, it's nice to have those disclaimers in your back pocket or on your materials. You know, here we have the League of Women Voters does not support or oppose candidates or political parties. You know, also the green collar communities and its partners do not support or oppose candidates or political parties. This voter guide is being shared for educational purposes only. And so it's always a good idea to have that and also to mean it and to follow it. So now let's talk about voter outreach activities, and that include voter registration and get out vote campaigns. If you're going to engage in voter registration, you need to ensure it's nonpartisan, and as well as that you are following state laws, state regulations surrounding voter registration activities. All 50 states have all sorts of different regulations. And we have guidelines on our Boulder Advocacy on AFJ website to help you guide those. So you want to make sure that there's no reference to candidate or party. You want to make sure that there's no suggestion of who to vote for, and make sure that the service is available to everyone. And you want to train your volunteers and staff that they understand the perimeters of what they can and cannot do. If they need to know that if someone comes up to them and says, well, do you want me to register as a Republican or as a Democrat? Who should I vote for? You want to make sure that they understand that they cannot say, they cannot answer that question. Just apologize and you can't answer that question. And make them stick to that. Make sure that if somebody comes up and they have a hat or a t-shirt on with somebody that they wouldn't support, they still have to offer that voter registration service to that person. So here we have two examples of register to vote here, and we have another one here. As you can see, you wouldn't want any partisan notations or anything in order to entice somebody to register a vote. Also, last thing, you want to make sure that you're aware of any funding sources. If any of your grants or private foundation or government grants, make sure that you have the understand what grants you can use or funds you can use, because some of them may be, you may be, prohibited in some of your grants of using them for voter registration. You have to be careful. Also, you need to ensure that you are not offering any incentives to get people to register. You want to know and follow all of the state regulations and procedures for voter registration activities. And that includes from handling any of the applications and turning them in. So now that everyone is registered, it's time to get them out to vote. So GOTV campaigns, nonpartisan GOTV can be educational. You can discuss how to vote, where to vote. You can discuss the importance of voting. You want to encourage all eligible voters to vote. You don't want to include any bias against a party or a candidate. You're not going to coordinate with any candidate or party for this activity. You also want to target for nonpartisan reasons, and we'll talk about that. So also using wedge issues. We want to be careful about using wedge issues. So here we have I vote, and the first one gets a green light because it's just talking about how to request your ballot, what to do when you get the ballot, to sign the affidavit, and when to turn it in. Second, we have vote the environment. We call that that could be a wedge issue depending on the candidates, where you are located in the country. We give I vote the environment just as itself a yellow light. It could become a partisan activity depending on what else you say, like I vote the environment because I'm voting against the pipeline, or I support the pipeline, or don't support the pipeline. Something like that could be more political and more wedge issue. So you need to be very cautious. And lastly, when we say vote pro-choice, again, something like this, we give a red light to, because it's encouraging voters to vote pro-choice, meaning vote for those pro-choice candidates or vote for that pro-choice party. So there are ways that you may want to target voters or determine how you're going to reach out to certain voters. Mail programs, phone banks, these are costly, and you need to think about who are you going to contact. And we call this targeting. C3s, you can target in a nonpartisan way. You can target and only talk to or educate the people about voting your natural constituency of your organization, people who live in the region your nonprofit operates, people who you serve. Good question. I'm just, Annette, good question. That's a good question. So targeting people who live in the region your nonprofit serves, people that your nonprofit serves, your clients, your patients, the ethnic community, the community that you serve, the people that you hope to serve. You can also target. You could also target historically underrepresented voters, those who are historically underrepresented at the polls. That includes people of color, first-time voters, young voters, new citizens who are new voters. You can target them. You can decide, okay, I'm going to send out that mail piece educating on how to return the mail-in ballot or what their rights are at the voting booth. I'm going to talk to them because I want to encourage civic engagement under those underrepresented populations. This is how you can target. Oh, Amy, that's a good question too. And I want to get that to you. So that good question right now, because we're going to talk about as an employee or volunteer, you still have rights as a person. Okay. So to Annette's question, recognizing that you can't give legal advice, could you comment on red flags, green lights on educating Project 2025, a set of partisan policy impact at work, long-standing truck? Yes, I'm aware of Project 2025. I wonder about this. I think I'm going to give it a yellow light right off the bat, but maybe yellow to red, depending. That's a tough question. Very tough question, because I think it's almost becoming a platform, the party platform, which I think, but if you can still engage in the advocacy that you engage in, maybe not necessarily in response or encouraging about the issue and not about the party, not about thinking of all the facts and circumstances, talking about those issues, advocating for those issues and against those policies themselves as policies, versus talking about them in any political sense that's the conservative side, or that's the Republicans, or that's these candidates. Okay. How much trouble would you be if one of your volunteers went rogue despite training and broke the rules? So I think that's where, Amy, you're going to have all your everything documented. Like, we do this training. Here's the training that we gave them. Here's the script that we want them to stick to. Like, just take care of it quickly and right away. Some folks that speak to Hill officer people, what red flags do we stay away from those conversations? Well, I think when you're working, Ainsley, when you're working on the Hill offices, or if you're working with the administration, you are working with them as elected officials. You're working with them in their official capacity as an office holder, as a regulatory agency, not as a candidate. Not as a candidate, not in the elections. You're talking about, you keep it to the policy, you keep it to the issue, you keep it in their official capacity. You can continue to lobby, you can continue to advocate for those issues and policies. Remember, they have this one hat on, and their hat is an elected official, an agency official, not as the candidate or party official. Okay. They have two hats. They need to stay with their official hat on when they're on the Hill, when they are, in their elected office. Okay. So let's talk about employee or volunteer 501c3 and the Constitution and the rights you have as a person. So you have a right as an individual to be partisan, to express your opinion and to vote. All of these rules that we've been talking about apply to your staff members, to your board members and volunteers acting on behalf of the 501c3, not those who are acting in their individual capacity on their own free time. So again, make sure you know which hat you have on. So for example, I work in DC. I've worked for other political organizations and nonprofit organizations. I've been to rallies on my own. I've bought those tickets to those fundraisers, but when I do that on my personal capacity, I know that I am doing it on my individual capacity. And I may say people that work for other organizations, and if I don't have to run away from them, I just have to remember and refer to myself as the individual, right? I'm also not using organizations' resources, staff time, email, copier. I have my own Gmail account, not my work account. I'm not using my, when I'm at work, I'm not doing any personal work. I am not, when I see people out and if I'm at a political event, I'm going to distinguish myself, from being the organization. I'm going to distinguish myself as an individual, not as an organization representative. And lastly, if you're, use disclaimers as appropriate. If you are invited, organization's name is for identification purposes only. If you are on an invite or if you are on a, if you're introduced as your organization, just always say, I'm not here representing my C3. I'm here at this event as a private citizen. Also, if you are, let's say that you are responsible for social media, for your organization, remember that to have your work account and a personal account. Make sure that you keep them separate. And that here we have my friend Leslie, she had an AFGA work account where she only engaged in AFGA appropriate likes and postings. And then she had her personal account that she could do, her own personal capacity. So, and to get back to your question, and if one of your volunteers goes rogue. So I think this is in AFJ on one of our resources, we do have policies, and I can follow up when we do the follow up with the slides and everything. I can follow up with that with a policy, having a policy of, this individual activities policy that you can train your volunteers on, and that you can show that you follow this, is a good factor to do. We are also going to, we're at the very end of this, and I'm going to stop sharing soon. And then we're going to open it up to all questions. So from today, we'll send out the slides and the recording from this, but we'll also send you copies or links to our rules of the game. And rules of the game is on nonpartisan election activity, what you can do. We also have rules of the game, our podcast, which I always do a shout out for. And we also have voter guides or voting resources on practical guidelines on voter activity in the states. These are particular to state regulations. And so you can always reach out to us for technical assistance at advocacy@afj.org. You can call us at 866-NP-LOBBY, or that is you can get our online form at that QR code. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to open it up to more questions and anything. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Thanks so much, Susan. I think you have another question in the chat from Deidre.
Okay, so opinions are my own. So opinions are my own, personal and speech on social media.
This was,
So-
I was just gonna jump in because we've been talking about this at my organization and our comms director is very much thinking about the types of sort of instructions that we give to staff. And I think he just wanted, because typically this is what we've done in the past, and whether that's still sufficient, particularly for someone who might be at like an executive director level or someone who may work on the comms team, and depending on who the audience is, might identify someone very much with a particular organization.
Right.
So
Yeah.
if the opinions are my own in a personal account, that feels like enough, or have there been instances?
Yeah, I think it is when it's their personal account. They couldn't use the organization's account, or like if your executive director or your president has a organizational account, they can't say, well, opinions are my own on their organizational account, because they can't, they still got their hat on. So I think in their own personal accounts, opinions are my own, this, I'm as an individual, that could be, yes. Yes. But I would
Okay.
keep, keeping them separate.
Yeah, I think people are good at the separation. I guess
Yeah.
it's depending on the audience, they may perceive someone's personal account to be related to the organization, but I guess that's on the individual. Nothing we can do about that.
Right. Yeah. And we'll follow up with our with a guidelines for that. We have a model model individual activity policy for organizations to use or to take inspiration from. So are there any other questions? Well, if not, it's been great talking to you this morning. I've really enjoyed this. I really enjoy talking and learning about other organizations and teaching organizations. So we will follow up in a day or two with the slides and with some follow-up materials and a recording of this, a recording of the meeting for you. Great.
Thank you so much, Susan, for coming to talk to Global Health Council and our members and partners about election advocacy. We really appreciate it.
Yes, and again, if anybody has any follow-up questions, just reach out to us at advocacy@afj.org. We do have our council takes turns. We have a manning that email and the phones, and we will respond to you within 24 and 48 hours as soon as we can with any questions you may have. And yes, you should be able to share the slides with colleagues. Yes. Great. Well, everybody have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.